Kia ora, I'm Nadine Higgins and welcome to the final day's program for Visionweek NZ, coming to you again from the Royal New Zealand Yacht Squadron, where in March next year we defend the America's Cup. And here is the silverware that we'll be fighting for, a trophy that has the power to unite the nation behind one boat. And when you think about it, he waka eke noa, we are all on this boat, Aotearoa, together. And in the face of a pandemic that took the world by surprise, we are united behind the need to reset our course for the future. During Vision Week, we've heard the ideas, hopes, dreams, aspirations and strategies of inspirational Kiwis for our post-COVID world. We want a future where we can address some of the underperforming areas of our society, but more importantly, we can leverage our core strengths, our values, our safe physical location, connectivity and an inclusive, cohesive society as a base for change. Today we hear some final thoughts and afterwards Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern joins us live for an important message. Vision Week, remember, is a not-for-profit event that has started a national conversation about a shared vision for the well-being of all of us. It's not affiliated to any one business, government entity or political party, and the results will be made available to all Kiwis following the event. This week, we've been receiving your questions and ideas and sharing as many as possible on the program. Please keep the conversation going on our website and on social media. Here are some ideas from our viewers.
Kia ora, I'm Sanjana from the Regional Council. My vision for the Bay of Plenty is connected and thriving communities.
Hi, my name's Paul. I'm the Regional Coordinator for Coast Care Bay of Plenty. My vision is a healthy coastline which protects our coastal communities.
Hi there, my name's Steph Bathgate. I'm a Biosecurity Officer with the Bay of Plenty Regional Council. My vision is for our communities to have the knowledge, the skills and the tools to make all of their backyards pest-free.
Hi, I'm Jackson from the Land Management team and I've got a vision that every waterway in the Bay of Plenty is swimmable.
If I could offer one great infrastructure investment for New Zealand right now, it's water.
The big question we're asking as COVID restrictions ease is, will we put things back together the way that they were? In April, there were calls from the Prime Minister's Business Advisory Council for a business recovery task force and a reform commission. Andrew Grant is on the PM's task force and he spoke with Greg Ward about not letting this moment in time be wasted.
So look, the first just underlying piece of philosophy around this is that this is a unique moment in history where it's all hands to the pumps. And we actually need the best folk putting aside differences and actually saying, how do we roll up our sleeves? How do we chop wood and carry water together to get done what needs to get done? In our view, there were two challenges really for us as a society, as an economy, as a people. One was around the immediate recovery and making sure that we don't have a dip that becomes so deep that we can't recover from it. When you think about the medium-term solutions required about how do you make certain interventions, what are the right projects, infrastructure projects to build? How do we actually keep enough of the capacity in the tourism industry together? How do we retrain the number of workers that we're going to need to retrain? There is solutions that will be required that no one has a monopoly on truth on. And actually, we need to work together to be able to work on that. So we argued the need for a task force to be able to work on that. And by the way, there's lots of international examples of where those have been exceptional. So that was the logic of the task force. The logic for the second is that this is a moment in time to reimagine. Look, again, we had pre-existing conditions in many parts of our economy and our society. Tourism being a case in point. How do we reimagine what we wanted that to look like? Likewise in healthcare, I think that healthcare was before COVID facing an existential issue. We're dealing with a healthcare system everywhere in the world that's moving from focused on acute diseases to chronic diseases. The challenge of healthcare today is very different to what it was 15, 20 years ago. There's affordability. We're also moving to where preventative is going to play a much more meaningful role.
It sounds as though you're confident that eventually New Zealand will emerge perhaps even more attractive to overseas investment than it is now.
I have no doubt. And look, I'd absolutely back New Zealand's resilience, who we are as a people, what we've done before. For me, there's no doubt about where we're going to be in 3-4 years' time. I think for me, that the thing to get right is how do we play the next couple of years? And I think the true test of character is not when things are going well. It's when the heat really comes on and things don't look so great and things aren't going so well. The reality is we are going to have a challenging 12 months. Will we really rise to the occasion, and will we behave in a way that the world might incent us to behave differently, but we rise to the occasion and we rise above it, and we're at our very best in the toughest of times.
Can you imagine what changes that we've been forced to adapt to that will probably keep even after recovery arrives? And I'm thinking of online shopping, remote workplace. What are the changes that we suddenly find we quite like?
For me, COVID has been an amplifier and an accelerator of things that were happening anyway. And many of the things that I've talked about, working from home, that a job ends up being more of a portfolio of activities rather than an occupation, and doing that, a little bit at home, a little bit I think the future of work has significantly been accelerated. I'm hopeful that COVID will prove to be an accelerator around doing the necessary things around climate change. I hope we learn from the GFC and actually accelerate climate change interventions and initiatives rather than put them on the back burner until the world gets back to normal. Because the other thing we know this time, the world is not going to get back to normal. It will be a next normal, but it's not going to go back to the way it was.
Andrew joins us live later in the program to analyse what we've heard back from communities, businesses and regions throughout New Zealand, and to answer your questions. And remember, you can submit your questions through the forum section on our website. The big winner of lockdown was certainly the environment, as roads and skies cleared and factories closed. So how big a part will environmental concerns play in New Zealand's future? Belinda Henley discussed what's next with Climate Change Commission Chair Rod Carr.
It is very early days to be able to understand the true impact of the COVID lockdown and the unfolding pathway we're now on. How much of the change in people's experiences, how much of the disruption in business as usual is merely transient, that we'll work through and put it back how it was, and how much may cause permanent changes in what we produce and how we produce it, where we work and where we live. For example, it's quite conceivable that some underlying trends towards more distributed workplaces and more digital engagement will put more pressure and opportunities for rolling out high capacity digital infrastructure. At the same time, it may reduce the demands on other types of infrastructure that required many people to move from where they live to where they work. But exactly how that plays out remains to be seen. Hurrying to get everybody back into the CBD so they can go buy coffee at the local coffee shop is nuts. We need to figure out whether there are lower carbon footprints from having certain jobs always done remote from the CBD, rather than moving people into a CBD.
Have your experiences during lockdown changed the way you view what's important?
Well, certainly prior to lockdown, in my role as a director of a number of companies and as chairman of the Climate Change Commission, there was a reasonable amount of travel. As a consequence of lockdown, that travel was removed from my diary. And in reflecting on it, it is pretty clear that there are some circumstances where being there matters a lot. In family occasions, in certain types of engagements, there is no near substitute for being there. But there are also significant opportunities where you can be present without being there. And that learning that we've all gone through, that competence that we've developed and the confidence we have about using presence without being there to get business done, I think is potentially a long-term advantage for lifestyles, less time invested in travel, and for the environment, less emissions and moving our bodies around from place to place. So that may be one of the more permanent changes, but to lock it in requires businesses and employers to change their expectations, as well as for workers to embrace different ways of working. I also think lockdown wasn't necessarily a fair test of working from home, when some were required to deliver childcare and home-based education, along with developing and delivering their professional competencies. I think probably once the kids go back to school, as they now have, there may be a better quality experience for many who are working from home.
If you could set a new course for New Zealand's future, what would your priorities be?
Two in particular. One is to create a much more sustainable society. And by sustainable, I would have three agendas: do no harm, put it right, and make it better. And the do no harm means we really do have to stop doing dumb things that make the situation worse. The putting it right means this generation has an obligation to future generations, not to merely pass on what we have done, but to put it back how it should have been all along. And finally, I think there are significant opportunities to create a better future, a brighter, cleaner, greener, healthier, more resilient future for the generations to come. And I would also focus on it being an inclusive society, that we cannot create a community where alienated and disaffected groups and vulnerable groups pose a threat to the stability and prosperity of all.
And lastly, Rod, can you think of the time where having a vision meant extraordinary things were achieved?
Well, I reflect on the time in February 2011 after the Christchurch earthquakes, while I was Vice-Chancellor at the University of Canterbury. And the university's vision statement, which we had reviewed a couple of years before, of tangata tua, tangata ora, people prepared to make a difference, was certainly front of mind when, in those early days and weeks after the earthquakes, we had to prioritise what were we going to do and why were we going to do those things. And reminding ourselves at the heart of that academic institution were its people, its students and its staff and all the people who made learning and research possible. And that the priority wasn't about the buildings, it was about the people. And that certainly is a reminder that having meaning and purpose to what we do is incredibly important in shaping and delivering a better future. So put people at the centre of the conversation about climate action, the conversation about recovery, the conversation that we need to have about how do we create a sustainable, inclusive future for people.
With climate change posing perhaps an even greater threat to our future than the COVID pandemic, what are the major industries that we should be investing in now? We put the question to Innovator of the Year, Ian Taylor.
Well, I think there's an enormous opportunity here for New Zealand if we start looking at what's in the natural world that can start bringing us the solution. So, for example, the seaweed that can reduce methane gas in animals by up to 95%. Imagine the difference that makes to our economy, our farming economy. One thing we've learned from COVID is that food is at the top of the list. All we've spent money on for 7 weeks is food. We tend to think of our farmers as kind of being the past part of our business, and that, you know, companies like ours, technology companies, we're the future. Well, actually, this was a big warning for us, or big light for us. Food was really, really important, and we are really, really good at it. So now I think is where we start to bring technology and farming and food together. And maybe one of the areas of technology that could really thrive in New Zealand is how we change that reputation we have for creating quality food and looking at different means of doing that. One of the other things we need to step back and think about is what are those major industries that drive our economy? And in particular, we have agriculture, we have tourism right at the top. And tourism has always concerned me, because what tourism does is demands more and more people come here, which actually damages and threatens what it is that's unique about us. And we've seen it in Venice and in places all over the world where tourism has actually destroyed what it was. We've seen the impact of losing tourism here. It's been devastating. But if you take another step back and think, what does tourism actually do for us? Well, it creates low-value jobs, and also the low-value jobs of people living in high-cost places. So now they can't even afford to pay their rent. Tourism is important, but now is the time to step back and say it really should be a high-value product. How do we make tourism a high-value product? And the way New Zealand has handled COVID has brought it to the world attention. And I think there's a really great option for us to go, you know what? No more freedom campers spoiling the environment. No more of this, no more. What do we do to make this a high-value industry, creating high-value jobs? The other industry, of course, that's a big driver, agriculture. So again, we take agriculture and the other major industry, technology, to ensure that we are now creating the most high-demand, sustainable products in the world. It doesn't seem to me like it needs to be a big shift. Tourism remains really important, but let's make it high value. Our agriculture is critical to the world. Food is critical to the world, but let's make it high value and use technology to do that. So I think that's something we need to be looking at as we explore what are the major industries we need to be investing in.
I mean, we like to think of ourselves as a nation of innovators, and you've certainly made a career from innovation. Do you think it's time more than ever for our innovators to step up and show real leadership?
I always say the only thing new about the idea of innovator is the word innovator. If we look back to the first people who arrived in Aotearoa, our Polynesian navigators who left Asia 3,500 years ago, at the same time the pyramids were being built. These are stories we haven't shared with our young people. But if we start to share them, then that idea of innovation is in our DNA. That's where the number 8 piece of wire came from. You don't become an isolated island at the bottom of the world where you have to travel across oceans to get here to find it without being innovators. So I think New Zealand has at its core this idea of innovation, and it hasn't stopped. Look at Peter Beck firing those rockets back to the stars that brought us here in the first place. The friend of mine used 3D printers to design a $1.8 billion building in China. During COVID, he turned those printers into making face masks. He made 16,000 face masks to give to local frontline supporters. So there's innovation has been going all through COVID, but it's just a pickup of our number 8 piece of wire.
Ian, let's move on to one of your new projects, which is something you're really passionate about, the Lands of the Voyagers. Can you tell us a little bit about why you're working on this project and a bit of the background behind it?
As I look at the world and the people who change things, I've sort of given up on old people. I'm 70 this year, so I'm one of them, so I can say it. So I've turned my focus to young people, and I look back to think of what I didn't learn in schools, actually, and I never, ever learned the story of the Polynesian navigators and engineers, scientists, astronomers, astrologers who made it here. So last year it became a sort of a project of mine to put together something that we could give to all of our young people, Māori, Pacifica, Pākehā, Indian, all of our young people, and tell them this story. As a boy, I never realised that even before the Vikings had launched their ships across the seas to Britannia, the Polynesians had already launched their waka haurua across the massive Pacific Ocean, destined ultimately for Aotearoa. It's a story that begins of a people who travelled across the Pacific Ocean using state-of-the-art craft, guided by the stars, the sun, and the ocean currents only. And it's a story that finishes with Peter Beck firing rockets in a partnership with Māori on the first place to see the light of a new day back to the stars that brought us here in the first place. And I think if we can get our kids seeing that's what all of the cultures in New Zealand coming together can achieve, then I have huge faith in our young people, which is why this has been delivered to primary and intermediate schools, because I believe they can change things in a generation.
And why do you think it's so important to really capture these children and I guess inspire them into believing that they can accomplish in some of those fields you're talking about, like science and technology?
Kids are always optimistic. I mean, we seem to get it knocked out of us as we get older. So I remember a Māori lady telling me once, as we talked about what we needed to do about our young people, and she said, just give them a need to be proud. Make them love themselves. And actually, when you start to see these stories, they do make you proud. And they're delivered by a young Māori girl, fluent in the reo, has the most beautiful English, and she delivers all of these stories with no anger, no blame, no hate, just an excitement about the future if we know all of these stories.
When you hang out on an island long enough without an iPad, you start to notice stuff.
If we're thinking about what comes out of COVID, we have to do it fully informed. We have to know all of the stories, and we do need to step back a little bit and go, I know I used to think this, but now I should listen.
Well, I think I know your answer to this next question, Ian, but if you could set a new course for New Zealand's future, what would be your priorities?
Mother Earth Papatūānuku has sent us enormous messages through this, and the priority should be, let's step back and listen to what she said, because things like this can happen again. But we have seen she's cleaned up the air, she's got people talking to each other, we've become kinder to each other, and as a country, a team of 5 million people, we have shown the world how you handle this. We are a world leader, so let's hold on to that and not fall back and forget what it was that was achieved.
Can you think of a time where having a strong vision for your iwi, for your business, for your country, meant that something really extraordinary was achieved?
I think that comes back to always understanding the why you did something. From my perspective, over 30 years ago, I had a vision that we'd create a company down here that just created really cool jobs. And 30 years later, it's here. I think now there's an opportunity for all of us to come together and start thinking about that future for this waka. He waka ekanoa, we've all been in it together. It's a waka that has everybody looking at it going, hasn't it been amazing what they have done? And I really, really hope that we don't fall back into that divisiveness again. This isn't about one party or the other party. I think as a country, we've seen what happens if we start to work together. My hope is that even in our politics, we come together to understand that there's a bigger vision for this country. We should all be in this waka working together.
In a different time, jobs were often for life, and we developed financial systems to support older New Zealanders in their retirement. Today, the issue of superannuation looms large, especially for the young people who face the prospect of funding our baby boomers. Greg Ward discussed the intergenerational tensions that are brewing, but also his positive take on our future with economist and author Shamabeel Yaqub.
Let's start with retirement. What now for the over 60s? Should they consider stepping aside for the betterment of the economy?
Well, for the older folk in New Zealand, I think what we'll find is ageism will be rife and they will find it very difficult to access jobs. Unfortunately, a lot of people who are older continue to work because they have to, because they need the income, because they might have lost a lot of their wealth because of falling equity prices or whatever. So I don't think it's about asking people to step aside. It's about asking, can we support people in every stage of life?
And what are your thoughts on government superannuation?
Government superannuation is setting us up for intergenerational warfare because the current system is unsustainable. It's not because New Zealand super in and of itself is unsustainable. It's all the additional burdens that will come with it, with the accommodation supplements and the special needs and all those other things. Aging is going to be very, very costly, and that will have to be borne by young folk of the future. We can't afford to have intergenerational warfare in a population of 5 million. We can fix this stuff now. And the fix is relatively simple. We need to make sure that our welfare system, just like welfare for poor folk, is also means tested for over 60s, over 65s.
How does New Zealand look in a global context as we plan our recovery?
In my mind, New Zealand is as well placed as we can be for this recovery. We started this recession with the lowest amount of debt. We've seen the most active investment by government in the world. We've got an economy that is resilient and flexible. But most importantly, we have a population that is united. We've seen a huge amount of working together and egalitarianism in the way that we've approached the crisis. And I think that sets us up to respond to the crisis and the recovery better than many of our peers.
What excites you most about the future?
What excites me right now about the future is the opportunity that this will give us for our young folk. Despite the inferno of the recession, from the ashes will rise bright new ideas, and those will be implemented by bright young people. The more we can support that, the better the outcome and the better the future for New Zealand.
As an economist, how do you suggest we resolve some of the systemic problems that we've had in New Zealand?
Well, the systemic problems in New Zealand are long-standing, and that's a reflection of our culture and our values. We have voted and asked for this system to be like this. We have to ask for something different. We have to value something different. And the guiding principle for us should be that the economy and the government should be about making more New Zealanders better off.
Shomobile, we have in our audience a wide variety of people all with an interest in infrastructure. Do you have a message for these business leaders, entrepreneurs, or anyone watching about what they should be thinking and doing in the next 12 to 24 months?
When we look forward to the next couple of years, I think we have three priorities. Make sure we create local jobs. Make sure we think about the future. Make sure those projects are good for our children and grandchildren. And make sure these projects are green. We can't afford to invest in the wrong things in the wrong way in this environment.
That's the long-term approach. In the short term, many of us are looking just for a trans-Tasman bubble. How significant is that if it does come off?
Australia is our closest trading partner, and many Kiwis live in Australia. It's really important we get the bubble because it will mean that there is a level of normalcy that comes back. It won't take us back to what we had pre-COVID, but certainly it will give us an ability to trade and travel and engage with each other like the cousins that we are.
We attracted enormous international attention. Many saw us as an early leader, as a brave country willing to, in the words of the Prime Minister, go early, go hard. Again, is that a feel-good factor for New Zealanders, or could that translate into future investment and trading relationships?
I think New Zealand has positioned itself really well through this crisis. We have shown that the response and the approach that we have taken is compassionate and is holistic in its approach. Very similar to what Australia has done, actually. But it does mean that we have this ability, as we open up, as we do it earlier and better than other countries, that New Zealand becomes a target and a destination for investments and ideas and people. Anything that shines a spotlight on New Zealand is positive because we are a global country. We are a highly connected country. The connectivity gives us a huge amount of benefits, and I think New Zealand has shone through this period of the crisis.
Well, let's wrap up the day by finding out whether you're getting enough sleep and how happy you're feeling. This must be an incredibly interesting time for you, but how are you feeling?
It's like the Chinese proverb, right? May you live in interesting times. And unfortunately, we're living through the most stressful and most interesting of times, at least for an economist. I think we're blessed in that we're able to understand and try and help shape the responses that we have. The way we will be judged, this generation and the people who are in the media, in the expert positions and the positions of leadership, we will be judged by our actions and our contributions. My goal is to be present, to offer the best that I can, and I hope it means that we're making good decisions and we're holding scrutiny up to bad decisions.
Throughout Vision Week, we've heard from school children, community leaders, government agencies and businesses. And now, with an important message for the nation, Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern joins us live.
Kia ora koutou katoa, ngā mihi nui ki koutou, and thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today toward the end of what I hope has been a fruitful week of discussion, debate and different perspectives. And it's all being delivered in formats that might be a little different to what we're used to. That's because in a few short months, our worlds were turned upside down. And while in many ways we're still in the middle of a tumultuous and changeable period in our history, now is the precise time that we should be asking ourselves, what next? So let me start first of all with a thank you to Paul and everyone who's been part of Vision Week, whether you've been speaking, contributing ideas, or simply listening, because we are navigating new waters and we all have a role to play in what comes next. And it's that which I'd like to speak to you a little bit about today. But before I kick off, a quick reflection from me. In the midst of our response to COVID-19, somewhere in the middle of lockdown, I received a letter. Now, this in itself is not remarkable. With people having a bit more time on their hands, perhaps unsurprisingly, we got a bit more correspondence than usual. Now, I don't have a chance to read every single letter that comes my way, but I do make a point of reading all of the letters that come from children. For me, they're a bit of a guide on whether we're doing enough to look above the horizon, to think about not just the here and now, but the future. Children, they look at challenges differently. Homelessness makes absolutely no sense to a child. Why can't we just house everyone? Ignoring climate change is not an option when you're a child. Inaction is as good as telling them that it's their problem, not ours. And plastic, especially straws, are weapons of destruction in the eyes of turtle-loving children who put animals before convenience. These are the letters and words and hopes of children. And while there may have been a brief change of topic for them during lockdown, these hopes haven't changed. But perhaps our approach should. And so it was one day, while in the midst of a pile of letters from both children and adults, that I read one that had a very simple phrase in it that stood out to me. It's a phrase that is common in the space of aid, development, and resilience. But in amongst COVID, letters from children and all the challenges we're facing, these three letters seemed perfectly timed. Build back better. There have been moments dotted through our history that have given us cause to stop and reset. Sometimes those moments have been taken, sometimes they have not. Now, I would argue that this moment is different. It's not that one part of our system has collapsed, that there's been a technological disruption that caused us to rethink our modes of operation, that we've been faced with the reality that our rapid development is unsustainable and therefore threatens development in itself. It's that all of those things are happening at once. We aren't at a fork in a road. We're at a spaghetti junction. Multiple challenges are all colliding at one point in time. But rather than careering down the road, we've had to stop. We've been forced to reset. We've been given the opportunity to reassess where we are and where we're going and to rebuild better. So as we pause at this juncture, what are our priorities? The things that determine the road that we'll choose to travel. In many ways, we determine them with our response to COVID-19 itself. We chose to protect our people in order to protect our economy. We chose to live up to who we are and what we are known for to safeguard our future. We chose our own path. And in my mind, that same approach needs to be taken as we move forward. Now, I know that our team of 5 million will have different views on what that should look like, and we should hear those. Unified does not mean uniform. But the unity we've shown through our collective health response to COVID must continue as we rebuild together. Our team can be greater than the sum of its parts by listening and learning from one another, by embracing ideas which may come from unusual or unexpected places, ideas which may have in the past seemed fanciful or impossible, but which may now be the right solutions for the challenge we face. Or ideas which may be so simple they've been staring us in the face all along unnoticed. To do this though, it's going to take a whole team effort and working together. But where do we begin? What does building back better look like? A good starting point would be to see this period as an opportunity to tackle the problems we know we already had. On the social side, despite good progress, too many children still go to school hungry. Too many still don't live in warm, dry homes. And too many are still struggling with mental health issues on their own without support. Economically, we know we need to do more to raise productivity, diversify our economy, keep shifting from volume to value, and seize the opportunities that will arise as we come out from the shadow of COVID-19 safer and stronger than many of our international competitors. In September 2018, I set out our government's long-term priorities for the future, which would guide us beyond the day-to-day and the month-to-month. Priorities which would go beyond a single 3-year political term and instead look to 10, 20, even 30 years ahead. I refer back to that plan often. Every decision we make as a government fits within one of the 3 umbrella areas. Building an economy which is growing and working for all of us, and that includes ensuring it is clean, green and carbon neutral. Improving the well-being of New Zealanders and their families, and making New Zealand proud. Whether that's the work we do to tell our own story and history, or the work we do on the world stage. And in the aftermath of COVID-19, in the midst of our rebuild effort, these 3 priorities remain as important as ever. They are the destination we're seeking to reach as we navigate the spaghetti junction of this moment in time. In fact, if anything, this is the time and opportunity to speed things up. You will have heard us talk several times before about our economic plan to deal with the global impact of COVID-19. It's been based on the different needs at each stage, starting with the initial phase, where a quick and definitive response was required. Here, we sought to cushion the blow of COVID by providing a wage subsidy to support businesses and their workers, even before we went into lockdown. It's also included tax changes to assist with cash flow and increased financial support to those on the lowest incomes. The second stage has all been about recovery and providing ongoing support as we move out of the lockdown, for instance. That's included things like an extended wage subsidy scheme and sector support packages for tourism, sports and the creative sector have all been taking a heavy blow from COVID. But that brings me to that next stage of our plan, the rebuild. Here we've already set aside investment to support job creation and growth by addressing our infrastructure deficit, building more public houses, for instance, dealing with long-term issues like pest eradication and water quality through our Jobs for Nature Fund, and finally dealing with our skill shortages by making all apprenticeships free. This is the time to accelerate the solutions to the problems we already had. It's the time to build back better. But it's also a time for ideas and collaboration, which is why our team in government is doing what we can to draw together the best ideas from the best brains to implement the best solutions to these problems. And that's why I was so keen to speak with all of you today. We all have a vested interest in New Zealand coming out of these times better than before. This is our home. It's where we live, work and play. It's where our friends are and it's where we raise our children. And those children write letters. So I'm going to ask something of you now, but I don't want it to be all give and take and no give. So after my request, I'm going to offer something back. My request to all of you who have taken part over this last week is to please don't let this be the beginning and the end of your contribution. Keep doing what you're doing. Don't stop coming up with ideas. Don't stop providing your perspective and drawing on your experiences. Keep telling us what you think we should be doing and let us know when we're getting decisions right and when we're getting them wrong, whether directly through government mechanisms, whether it's through the media, whether it's through initiatives like Visionweek or even by social media. Please be a part of the conversation. And my promise in return is this, that we're listening, that we will continue to do so and that we will take action on the basis of what we hear. Earlier this week, I know you discussed the fact that no one has all the answers, that building back better is going to take a whole team effort, and I agree. It took our team of 5 billion to beat this virus, and it will keep taking our team of 5 million to beat the virus. It will take that same team effort to rebuild from its effects, which is why next week I'll be announcing a more formal process for us to pick up what you have been doing as part of Vision Week, to keep drawing together our shared experience and insight and enable us to build back New Zealand even better. I'm immensely proud of how we've collectively come together over the last few months with common cause. And while I know we have a long, tough road ahead of us, I know what we are capable of achieving together in the future. I thank you once again for inviting me to speak today. Please keep up the conversation. And if you ever feel compelled, please, by all means, write to me too. It could make all the difference. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa.
Thank you so much for that, Prime Minister. Well, today is our final live Q&A discussion for Vision Week New Zealand. Really excited to have with us Paul Blair, the founder of Vision Week New Zealand and the CEO of Infrastructure New Zealand, and also Andrew Grant, the global lead for the government sector from McKinsey, and also been sitting on the Prime Minister's Advisory Council. Maybe we'll start with you, Andrew. Thoughts on what the Prime Minister had to say?
Well, I love the phrase "build back better." I think that actually captures exactly what we want to do. I think the build, there's something there, that there's a lot that needs to be built, and the building back better, I think, is fantastic. So I love again, picking up on some of the things that I think we really have learnt from COVID, the team of 5 million, the idea of actually ideas come from unusual places, and how do we harness the magic of all of New Zealand. I love that. But for me, the build back better, there's an actionability to that. There's a lean and get stuff done. And that's also, I think Vision Week's just been fantastic in the ideas. But for me, there's also just something about how do we get to action? How do we take ideas to action? And I love that there was very much that flavour to that phrase in the Prime Minister's address that I think, now let's actually start doing some stuff.
Paul, one of the things we've heard all week, and the Prime Minister touched on, is how important as we come together as this team of 5 million, how important is that we collaborate.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what we've heard consistently all week is that different voices want to come in and they want to help. But I think they've found it difficult to actually find a way in. So I think the idea of sort of framework so that everyone can participate, but we're aiming at that North Star so they know where to participate. And then we move swiftly to action. I think Tamati Kruger said it, we can take a little bit of time to reset, but then we need to move to action for our people.
And one of the things too that I guess our Prime Minister has become really well known for is putting an emphasis and a real focus on mental health and actually looking after the well-being of our communities, and that also came through quite strongly.
Look, absolutely. And I also think that, well-being there is something about purpose, and there's something about, when you have a sense of direction, where you've got a sense of purpose, but when you're also gainfully employed. And again, that's where the thing we learn, it's not just for New Zealand, the thing we're also learning about responding to this crisis now, there's actually quite a premium on speed and a premium on, there will never be the perfect plan. Yeah. If we look back to the GFC, the countries that actually did best were not necessarily the countries that had the best plan, they were the countries that actually activated the plan the fastest. And that's just an emphasis that I would have again around mental health. I think, we've had this lovely phrase that I think the Prime Minister deserves enormous credit for that has been a bit unique to the world around be kind. But I also think there is something now around just action, and people need to be gainfully employed. They need to have a sense that we're working towards the greater purpose, but that we've actually got a job to do. And I think that's this emphasis on real action. And I think a preparedness to be brave around getting stuff happening is I wouldn't say just a New Zealand theme, but it's a global theme that we're learning. You'll never have the perfect plan. It's really important to act now.
And Paul, it's not just necessarily about us being kind to our neighbour and being kind to each other. She also talks about businesses acting with a real social enterprise when they come to make decisions about their future.
Yeah, so look, I sort of think of Aotearoa as potentially a big social enterprise opportunity. What is the role of our government? It's there to be there for our people. And in doing that, they can enable business. But equally, business should be enabling society. I think there's a bit of a view that business is there solely for profit, and you've seen the kickback against that in America, not just profits for people, for good. And that's really the opportunity to give people a North Star to aim at, and then they can participate to have this holistic approach that isn't just profit, it's about wider well-being benefits.
And just touching on her last point, it did feel like it was a real call to action. You know, she even invited people to correspond with her directly. She wants to see those ideas. She wants to see us continuing to work together.
Yeah, I mean, I think I heard a comment earlier today that in the infrastructure space, you know, it's brilliant that people could come into the Crown Infrastructure Partners process and put their ideas in. $136 billion worth of ideas for $3 billion. What is the mechanism that we're going to use in several areas, you know, whether that's in addressing child poverty or getting the economy started again, or accelerating our move to sustainable food, you know, being a food producer to the world. So I think those frameworks have got to come in, because governments aren't always set up well to be bold and to take risk. And so I think there's something in devolving a bit of authority in order to speed up, but that requires trust.
And look, where I just build on Paul's point, sometimes when I look at New Zealand, I feel like I'm a kid back doing high school science, where you've got all the right ingredients that you put into your beaker and the jolly experiment won't actually catalyse. It's not happening like it's meant to. And when I look at the goodwill, when I look at our leadership, when I look at the enthusiasm and capability of our business leaders, there's actually incredible intent, there are incredible ideas. But to Paul's point, we actually need the platforms that can enable that stuff to come together, and not just to have ideas, but actually to stand up projects, actually to get stuff to happen in the field. And I would just say of governments more generally, but I think even of New Zealand in particular in recent times, we've lacked some of those platforms that have really enabled that, you know, high school science experiment actually to have the good stuff catalyse, to produce, to build the bridge, you know, to make the new thing happen.
So at a tangible level, Andrew, what do you think those platforms are? What is that missing link?
Well, I think that one thing is just, for me, a little bit of a mindset of the ingredients will take collaboration between the public, the private sector and civil society in ways that we've never seen before. So I think there's a mindset, even in wartime, I think what we're facing now will need levels of collaboration. So you used the brave word before. I think we actually need to have a mindset of being prepared to be brave in who we actually partner with and how we collaborate with. So I know that mindset may not seem very practical, but I think mindset actually is a very practical thing about being open to genuinely having that collaboration. And then I think that, you know, when we look around the world, there are a number of governments have existing platforms like unsolicited bid platforms, like non-prescriptive expression of interest platforms that essentially say, listen, Belinda, if you've got a great idea, you know, bring it to us. But not just a idea, actually, you know, who, you know, what will you, real, you know, a proposition that is more truly shovel-ready. Exactly. And that's as I understand, look, I haven't been close to it, but when I understand some of the ideas that have come together, to date they've been apples and oranges. It's little, sometimes it hasn't been much more than a letter. It needs to be much more than a letter, but also we need to have the platforms that government has that can actually stand up, that can receive those ideas.
And any thoughts from you, Paul, on how we make these ideas reality?
Yeah, well, I think it was really notable at the speed that we moved when COVID was at its worst. And that was where we made decisions that were really based on Kiwi values. You know, let's be kind. Let's look for sustainable solutions, and let's look after our people. And you know, we have had a globally astounding result in terms of health. But those decisions were taken with really heart and gut. It wasn't head, it was what is the right thing to do. And despite the fact that we have some fantastic civil servants, it's quite noticeable that as we've come down the levels, that it's slowed down. And that says to me that there's something in the institutions and the way we take risk that isn't there to be as bold as we would like. And so I think one of the people earlier in the week said that, you know, New Zealand has been at the forefront of some amazing institutions, some new ideas. The RMA was a new idea, but the way we gave women votes and other things early on, our social services system. I think now's the time to really accelerate that change and think about the institutions we need in order to achieve what we need to go after.
And I think if our sort of theme today is where to from here, where to now, it really has been a substantial pivot, hasn't it, from really taking everything into consideration with a health lens and how do we protect our people, how do we keep our population healthy and safe, to, okay, we've done that, how do we save our economy?
Absolutely. And look, also just picking up on one of Paul's points, good governments have two modes in general. They are good in normal sort of operating conditions, and they're actually typically very good in a crisis. And we've seen that with our government. They've been exceptional in a crisis. We're now into that sort of intermediate zone. It's not going to get back to normal, but we're not in a crisis. But how do you actually create the institutions that can create the urgency to partner differently and to do things a bit differently? And just one idea, I had the privilege of serving the Chief Civil Servant of Singapore for many years. And he had a lovely saying that under normal conditions, you have normal eyesight. When you enter an environment like this, with one eye you need to pick up a telescope, and with the other eye you need to have a microscope. And you need to, Paul, you talked about the way we acted. You had the gut that thought about, we know the things that matter long term around climate change, around inequality. So let's focus on that. But at the same time, let's have the microscope that what are we doing this week to stand up project A, B and C that's consistent with that. And I think that mindset of acting at pace, it's the microscope of get it done and the telescope of we've got a North Star, we've got, well in our case, a Southern Cross. We kind of know where the direction is.
Well, that leads me very nicely on to my next question, which was to maybe put a bit of a global lens on things. You have lived and worked in Singapore and worked with other small countries. Singapore did this think big and go global in the 70s. What lessons can maybe New Zealand take from some of these other countries, and what example should we be following?
Well, I think by the way, I do think another thing that the great lessons that are coming from governments and societies at the moment are disproportionately coming from small countries. So I think we're in a good territory, and I'm really encouraged the way the Prime Minister has been engaging with other other leaders of small nations, because I think that's actually where we're finding insight at the moment. The thing that I would say in general from small nations, in these moments you have to be, again, I love our be kind phrase. I'd really love to add the be brave now. And I think for small nations in this moment, if we just go with the crowd, the bigger nations will always have an advantage. And I think this be bold around reaching out, the Productivity Commission, and you've highlighted some of the work around, we just need to be that much more global. The role that exports play in our economy needs to, in normal conditions, needs to be at a much higher level. Most countries, sadly, are going to look more inward as a result of COVID. We need to be brave enough to swim against the tide and become more global at a moment that the rest of the world's becoming more local. And I think if we do that, there's a huge advantage in that. But the temptation will absolutely be to follow everyone else and become more conservative, more risk averse, more inward looking.
And you were talking about that too, Paul, that danger associated with retreating behind our borders, which, as Andrew says, is maybe the easier or seems like the obvious option.
Yeah, well, I mean, we addressed this health crisis on the evidence and on the science, and we acted on that. We have a Productivity Commission which has gone and looked at the science and the evidence of what small countries need to do. We've currently got around about 30% of our exports, 30% of GDP being exports. It needs to be 60 or 70% in order to put us in the realm of countries that we admire, like Denmark or Switzerland or Singapore. So that means that we're pushing ourselves out to the frontier, really, and that pushes innovation, which Kiwis are actually really good at. But we need to pick a couple of those areas, and the Productivity Commission says those areas for New Zealand are being the leading producer of safe, sustainable, regenerative food. We could do that. If the Netherlands can be right up there, off a tiny, almost underwater country, we certainly can. And the second thing is technology. One of the most exciting things this week is this idea of a completely green electricity system with digital technology, sending our ideas to the world. We're a really attractive place behind our moat. Imagine a carbon zero platform for exporting our ideas and technology and services to the world. I think those are two fantastic places we should aim for.
Paul, one of the things that the Prime Minister also talked about was this concept of build back better. What did we learn from the Christchurch rebuild, and what lessons can we maybe take on board when it comes to the COVID recovery?
Yeah, so this is always sensitive coming from an Aucklander, but from what I understand when we go down there regularly, there was a period after that devastating quake which obviously affected people's lives in the same way that COVID has really affected people's lives. That there was there was a flowering of ideas, a bit like Visionweek, you know, and there was a real hope that we would go and we would rebuild a 21st century city, and that didn't happen. So that's that, you know, give me $1 for the idea and 99 for execution. So we didn't build back that 21st century city. And the other thing that we found is that it really affects people. If you don't know where you're going, the mental health and the anguish of only just getting to rebuilding our stadium 10 years later is an example of the time it took. You know, we've done this on a countrywide basis. So people and the mental health of Kiwis need direction and certainty in the spaghetti junction that the Prime Minister talks about. We still need some of those values and our Southern Cross so that we can give people hope and direction. Really important.
Andrew, I want to move on to a slightly different topic. Several people who have spoken this week, including yourself, have talked about COVID as a warm-up or a warning to a bigger impact from climate change. How do you think we can tweak this approach of this sort of team of 5 million coming together to really have action on the climate change front?
Well, I think one thing, you asked the question previously about what do small nations do. I think small nations also realise that they are small, and therefore they don't have every one of the 5 million really matters, and finding a way to get the very, very best and everyone feeling that they have a role. And I think that one of the things I would hate for us to, and I think we've got, when you do look at the tragedy of some of the large nations, they're more divisive and more divided than they've ever been. So I do think one point is just how do we actually really align around the things that really matter as Kiwis, but finding a way that actually we really meaningfully, not just listen, but actually involve everyone. And I think that that's just one thing that I do think the Singapores and the Denmarks of the world are very good at, the way that everyone actually gets tasked with something. Everyone can draw a line to how they're actually playing a role. And I think sometimes in New Zealand we can a little bit too much fall into the tribalism that play the big country game. And I think also sometimes there's a little bit we kind of pick you but no one else, where I think the Denmarks and the Singapores are often much better at saying, listen, you know, you all, here's where you fit. You know, yes, you know, we might have selected that, but we're still involving you in that way. And I think we could actually learn from it, because in COVID, I think we all did feel that we were doing our bit. You know, we're all, and I think with climate change, could we actually translate that? I also come back to this urgency point that everything that was done with COVID, we knew the playbooks were, you know, there in place. And it was, again, more the countries that have won are the countries that just listened to the science and read the playbook. The playbooks for climate change are there. It's just a matter of, are we reading them? Are we activating them? Are we feeling the same level of urgency that we did around COVID because it was there?
There was a comment that Dr. Rod Carr made earlier in the week, which I thought was really interesting, saying, you know, we've seen the impacts. We've seen our waterways clear up, our air become clearer. We've been out there enjoying our parks. But he said his fear was that this would just be transient, that we would all just go back to our ways of life. And he said it's so important now that we actually continue to unite and keep this momentum going.
Yeah. If I could just build on that as well, I think a particular New Zealand thing that we need to address is that we've had, you know, the team of 5 million. In governance, we have a different system for our central government and our local government. And I'm saying this as Visionweek because this is politics and this is hard. But the Resource Management Act and the impacts of climate are local. They're in the local government space, but the local government is not set up in New Zealand to deliver that. And so I think a real opportunity for us in our team of 5 million is to look hard at the systems with local government and central government and find a way of aligning those. Because at the moment we're unique, and a lot of countries are really envious of only having 2 layers of government. But those 2 layers of government far too frequently compete or talk past each other or don't have the right tools, or they have different accountabilities. And I think that climate change is going to make COVID look like a little bit of a warm-up. And we can't afford in this small nation to have those 2 layers of government not being as one.
Andrew, what are some of the biggest, best, most exciting ideas that you've heard this week? That's a tough question, isn't it?
Yeah, well, look, I mean, a couple of things. I mean, one is this idea that I heard about how could New Zealand lead the world around having the most intelligent virus-free border. I mean, the border matters so much to us. We could crack that problem in a really clever way, and if we did it quickly, it's a huge competitive advantage to be able to do it. So I know that's a very near-term one, but I'm very
The
excited
concept
about that,
of a smart border.
of a really smart, intelligent border in terms of. So I think that for me, just the immediacy of that, I think made it terrific. Look, I love this idea again. When you think about New Zealand, how we were created, our first, Māori, Polynesian, it was our blue water. It was coastal. I think we're reinventing coastal shipping in New Zealand around, autonomous, green, hydrofoiling, small containerised shipping that reinvents regional ports. That I think there's a real opportunity just to think differently about green transportation. Because logistics, the thing we learned about COVID is logistics also matters. Logistics that's really going to be important. I think we have an ability to think, kind of very, very differently on that front in terms of how we do that. Look, I'm also I think there's also, I'm a civil engineer originally, so just the practical stuff with climate change. I worry about where our infrastructure is all on the coasts. And the coasts are most vulnerable to climate change. I think the ability to be very realistic about the challenges that we have and what does that really mean for our basic infrastructure around electricity, water. I think we should really take a hard look at that. And I heard I know I'm sort of aggregating a number of ideas, but I thought I was quite taken by the honesty, the getting the decimal place in the right place around the challenge there. I thought that was actually a really positive thing around Visionweek as well.
What about you, Paul?
Well, I would say infrastructure is vitally important, but I think it's not about bridges or roads. It's not about hospitals. It's about delivering outcomes for people. And again, I think if we start there, what is the purpose we're trying to achieve? Then you can build infrastructure, or you can build skills, or you can find capital, or whatever it is. But that would be a great way to go. And things that I liked this week, I thought we had a Connecting New Zealand panel, and I really liked that idea because in COVID, we took away what we've seen as a basic right, the right for me to get in my car and come and see you, or to talk to you over Skype. Or to have the ability to fly to the Gold Coast for my holiday. That was all taken away, and we saw the impact on the economy. Some of it good and some of it bad. But, I think in connecting New Zealanders, there was this idea of, decarbonising our transport system through electricity. Electric flight. Imagine if you could come to New Zealand and you could fly to Queenstown on a wholly electric flight, which has come from green renewable electricity. I thought that was a fantastic vision from Rod Drury. I think we've got 200% capacity that we could increase our green electricity. We import $7 billion a year of oil. Why are we not speeding that up? That would be a very obvious place for us to go. So I think there's some great questions and a bit of bravery, a bit of evidence, and a bit of us all in together to get this done would be brilliant.
Right, we've got a question from Rigvendra for both of you, saying with the OCR expected to drop down from 2% to negative values by November and current policies around foreign investment, will foreign investors really be interested in investing?
Well, I think absolutely. I think we've got a proposition. Look, I'm a die-hard Kiwi, so I'll always say that we're the best deal on earth. But look, two things I would say. The proposition that we have was always attractive. What we've done with COVID and the response will make us even more attractive. However, my view when it comes to foreign investment is it's the old Warren Buffett. It's always better when you make the phone calls rather than you're on the receiving end of who shows up. And I've, been a little bit of a broken record for a long time. I would love us to be a little bit more proactive around this is where we want foreign investment, and we choose and we seek out who we want rather than, filter through whoever shows up.
For our benefits, right? The Productivity Commission is all about us going out to the world with our exports. It's about having that impetus coming in, but so it generates jobs, so it creates innovation, so it pushes us into new frontiers that add value. I think, brand New Zealand is about as good as it's ever been, and we have flying cars being tested in the South Island because, we're small, we're great rule of law, we're non-corrupt, we've got a great standard of living. I saw before COVID that Gallup, the global polling company, said that if we had, and this is well before the virus, if we had an open border, we'd have 11.5 million people turn up in New Zealand tomorrow. That was the highest ratio of sort of inward migration in the world. So we're really attractive on a world scale. I think that's gone up. So the question for us is, out of the Kiwi expats abroad, the Kia network, who are a lot of best and brightest, and people like the Edmund Hillary Fellowship, which brings the best and brightest here, who do we want? And if we're saying to them, hey, come here and contribute, and this is like how we'd like you to contribute, I think we need a population policy on what we want for our people, how many people, and then there's this piece about where, the regions, the cities, and local empowerment. Big questions, but this is the time to get the telescope out and look to that 30-year horizon.
Just one other thing I would add, however, I think I'm a fan of the right sort of foreign investment, but I also think you've got to save yourself as well. And I do think KiwiSaver has been a positive step.
Yes.
I still think it's a half step. And I do think we need to find more disciplines. One, if we really want to deal with inequality, KiwiSaver, in my view, can play a much more material role and to get to higher levels. Always very difficult for Kiwis to say nice things about Australians. But when you look at their levels and what they're doing and the role that their equivalent plays in funding infrastructure, I think it's a place that we can, again, with all, I think we can learn actually from our Australian cousins on where they've gone on that front.
Right, heading off on a slightly different tangent now from Joe. Here's a question for you, Andrew. Science and technology provided a great evidence-based approach to helping us deal with a health crisis. How could we rely more on STEM subjects, tech and innovation to lead us out of the economic crisis?
Well, I think it's a fantastic question. One thing that I'd also say, I've been so proud of New Zealand, the fact that we did listen to the science. But if I could be so bold, I don't think we do listen to the science on a number of other areas that really could matter. I know it can be politically contentious, but I wish we listened to the science just more on the opportunity for genetic editing, for example. I mean, you can't produce most vaccines today without genetic editing. I don't think you can really actually deal with carbon in the way that we need to without genetics playing a role. I'd much rather that we had a bolder national conversation that really listened to the science and didn't listen to the latest social media tweet on those. So I think for me, we've learnt a wonderful lesson in COVID. I'd love that we actually extended that conversation much more broadly in terms of, sort of listening to the science and the scientists. If you do listen to, and again, what can we learn from STEM? And so we know that many of if you look at COVID, the issue with the health side, those most impacted were those that had pre-existing conditions. I would argue it's the same for businesses and it's the same for industries. It was those that had pre-existing conditions. To the point about STEM, most of those pre-existing conditions, technology is what is the most powerful tool to go at them. So I'd love that we were bolder around looking at some technological solutions to some of our long-standing issues that we have as a nation. And I think that's a big thing that we can really take from sort of the technological way to break through some of our challenges. I think is for me one of the big insights that came out of COVID, and I'd love that we had that much more in the conversation more broadly.
Right, moving on to you, Paul, a question around what opportunities do we now have to better integrate Māori values and co-governance in sort of finding our way forward?
Well, I think that Kiwi values and Māori values align very, very well. So, fairness, sustainability, looking after our whānau, our communities, that really came to the fore, and it came to the fore naturally for Kiwis. We have co-governance in the treaty. I'd argue that we haven't really got it there to date. I think that also when we're looking at sustainable outcomes, and we've got tikanga that looks at 100 years, future generations, and looking after our environment and our people, that's exactly what we want right here, right now. But it takes more time. So I think there's a tension there, Andrew, between the need to act, the need to partner, which sometimes takes longer, and the answer will always be somewhere in the middle. But this is a time when those values need to come further to the fore and go faster, and I think all parties have got to come to the table on that.
Any thoughts on that from
you?
you,
Yeah,
Andrew?
well, I think we're learning the wisdom of when you do look at some fundamental Māori principles like kaitiakitanga. If you look at the way we value infrastructure assets or we think about the value of our environment, we've traditionally used commercial discount rates to value that. By definition, that means that you only value your environment for 15 years, which is nonsense when you think about the idea that Milford Sound is only valuable for the next 15 years. So I also think that we're starting to learn some very practical thing from Māori principle. You know, what actually are the discount rates that we should be applying to natural assets and a long-dated infrastructure assets that, in my view, is much closer to kaitiakitanga than it is to the commercial discount rates that we use today to assess these projects.
If I could build on that, I think New Zealand's got this fabulous well-being framework, but the way our systems work, we value the economic, and we sort of tend to either throw away or tick box the other three well-beings. And I think this is the opportunity actually, is that that framework offers a more holistic approach which really balances the needs of people, the environment, our cultures and our economy. It's all of those things. And I think we've got ourselves to a place where we, and you know, in our government we do this as well. We find the amount of money we've got and then we trade off the outcomes. And often what we might trade off is the softer values of environment or culture or society. And I think that, you know, a more sustainable world has those four values in it. And we explicitly, unfortunately, through COVID, had to put values on health and society in a way that we haven't done for a while. There's opportunity in that. I really think there's opportunity if we properly engage in investing in well-being.
Well, sadly, that's all we have time for. Thank you so much for joining us, Andrew. Thank you, Paul, for having this bold, crazy, big, ambitious idea and actually making it happen. It's been a week of just inspiring and really incredible conversations with so many great New Zealanders. So,
as the PM says, though, let's not make that the end. Let's make it from here to action.
Absolutely. And thank you to all of you for joining us, Vision Week New Zealand. As Paul says, please let's continue those conversations. But from us, that's all. Back to you, Nadine.
Thank you to everyone who submitted questions and comments, and to Andrew Grant and Belinda Henley. Tech Futures Labs CEO Frances Valentine has described COVID-19 as a midlife crisis for capitalism and management. She spoke with Belinda Henley about the far-reaching effects of the pandemic on capital markets, systems of management, and the way we work.
Look, if you think of the capital markets and what drives them, right now we're looking at the new economic parameters emerging. And first of all, after any form of adversity, particularly financial adversity, people buckle down and start thinking about their resilience. And financial resilience is at the top of that list. Is how much did I have in terms of reserves? How much had I overstretched myself? And what we do know is that a lot of people live with very little reserve. And it could be a week, could be 2 weeks of reserve, and in many cases, not at all. There's going to be a certain number of people saying, how do we think of capital? How do we invest in things which will give us better returns and security long term? But also thinking about management in terms of, do we have a system with management where we go through the motions? We turn up at the day, we attend a few meetings, we push some pieces of paper around, we decide on a few processes, and then we come out and we do it all over again. I think we're going to actually go back and say, why do we do it that way, and what's the end game? And I know, just even conversations within my own community and my peers around the world, the number of people who are saying, I'm not sure that the idea that I spend such a big part of my life working for an organisation to give them benefit when I'm doing something that I don't necessarily absolutely love. So I think managers are going to have to think about why people work for them and what they're getting from that. But our capital markets, how people invest, is going to be questions. We're going to find it harder probably to find financial investment from various parts of the community. The banks look different right now. So actually we are going to have to say, what will our economy be built on? Actually, is it's going to be the same economic kind of priorities that we've had previously? How do we future-proof our sector in New Zealand so that when we open the borders again and we become a trading nation again, that actually they're the things that people are going to be able to grow into and sustain us in the long term, but also managers and saying, what value do you bring to the role and what do you take from the role? And actually saying, is this really what you want the next 5 or 10 years to be based upon? So there's lots of questions being asked.
How important do you think it's going to be to have really strong and visionary leadership through this period?
I don't think there's ever been a time in my life that's been more important. We're seeing close up different leadership styles globally, particularly in the political fields, and how people are responding and resonating with either a pessimistic or an optimistic view. I think right now we need to think about risk in a very different way. So leaders often, their role is to really curb risk, but also maximize potential. There is almost a contradiction at all times of like, how do you grow things forward without taking risk, particularly if you've got shareholders and you're expecting people with returns and dividends out. But I think right now people will need to invest significantly more in research and development and being much more innovative if they're going to come through. So that changes the role of a leader to saying, okay, now we're going to bring about the best capability we possibly can. And one of the things I often say is, the brightest person in the room is the room. It's the collective power of many to be able to innovate. And I think right now there's a lot of hierarchical leadership where people at the top of the decision-making pyramid are making decisions for many. I think that needs to change, and there needs to be much more of a collective leadership style where people are getting on board their teams and understanding the viewpoints of people with different backgrounds. So that diversity card needs to be played more than ever. And I'm not talking about gender diversity, but I'm talking about background. The scientists need to work with the creatives, and the writers need to work with the people who understand engineering. We really need to understand problem solving, and leaders need to be able to identify actually how today's contemporary problems can be solved in a very different way.
If you could set a new course for New Zealand's future, what would be your priorities?
I think we need to diversify the industries and make sure that we're thinking through the lens of long-term industries which are highly sustainable, but also put us on the world map in terms of quality, and actually making sure we're highly informed and knowledgeable, and that we actually develop capability to take away this limitations of people working on these hourly rates, which the inequality in New Zealand is something we cannot be proud of and we need to change.
If you could ask for just one thing to be changed, what would that be?
That people would invest in themselves a lot more in terms of the knowledge sabbatical, actually taking time out in a given week and a given year as adults to make sure they continuously evolve and learn, but also unlearn. So actually forgetting some of the things that perhaps were true in a different time, and making sure that we have the best possible knowledge and information at our fingertips.
COVID disrupted not only lives and businesses on a local level, its effects on world trade may change relationships forever. Professor Sir Peter Gluckman, President-elect of the International Science Council, believes it's an opportunity for small countries like New Zealand to show moral leadership, work together and be heard.
We're going to a period of great uncertainty, risk, in which New Zealand's leadership, moral leadership, will be important. First of all, the China-US situation is very unstable, and while everybody will hope that level heads will prevail, it's not by any means clear that they will prevail. And that may force countries like New Zealand to find, on one hand, their traditional alliances with America pull you in one direction, and our large trading partner, being China, on the other hand, pulls in another direction. You have the potential to sell China seeds, which is critical to our supply chains, may become a point of tension. On the other hand, you've got Europe, which is now in a somewhat dysfunctional state as a result of COVID. Will they be able to move quickly on free trade agreements? The suggestion is they might want to show how quickly they can move to try and restore some sense of cohesion. But on the other hand, the World Trade Organization was fractured already before COVID. These are issues that, from New Zealand's point of view, are very important. We can't pretend that we can carry a big stick around them or a big carrot, but we can, because of our moral leadership and our respect and reputation in the world, be part of a team of countries that could work together to make real progress.
Interestingly, you and your colleagues embrace the idea of strengthening ties with China. That's despite growing concern about their handling of the virus. How do you exert moral leadership with China?
Moral leadership is for us to show to the world as a whole in New Zealand, and for others to look at us and decide whether we're exerting leadership or not. I don't think it's a matter of exerting on another country. I think the reality is China is our biggest trading partner. It's also the biggest player in our part of the world. I mean, we cannot ignore China. So therefore, we have to find a way to work with them and hope that over time, the demonstrations of countries that behave in a way with high values will have an influence. Now, I know that sounds naive, and I know that that's what since Jim Bolger's time, New Zealand's tried to do. But the reality is we can't separate ourselves from the fact at this stage they are the biggest source of our biggest markets.
No, but critics might say to you, we can't separate, but we shouldn't put all our eggs in one basket.
I would agree absolutely with that. And I think if you think about our reports, we've actually said we need to diversify our markets and diversify our products. But that takes time. It doesn't happen overnight. And I think New Zealand Trade and Enterprise and that have been trying to do that for a long time. But the size of the China market is so much easier for our individual traders.
You pointed to some smaller nations, including Japan as a potential partner in the future. Any others? Singapore?
New Zealand's already been working with a lot of other small countries, like-minded countries. We've worked with them well in different ways in the past. We can expand that group. We can show, there are many other small countries that are trying to follow the rule of law, trying to promote the interests of their citizens, and who have got interest in a multilateral, rules-based order in the world, would like to see organizations like the UN system restored, revamped, refurbished, whatever language you want to use. World Trade Organization, the World Health Organization has now become a point of focus, for example. The interests of small countries to work together to see that the interests of those countries are not part of G20, not part of G7, are properly heard in those corridors of international power and decision making.
The primary sector has always been a staple of the New Zealand economy and as an essential business was relatively unscathed during the COVID lockdown. Rachel Taulele, CEO of Māori agribusiness Kono and a member of the Prime Minister's Business Advisory Council, discussed the future of food and fibre and the importance of diversity with Belinda Henley.
What role do you think food producers are going to play, both in our economies and in our communities moving forward?
I think that the primary industry, we were really lucky to been given the privilege to be an essential business from the get-go. So after an initial period of uncertainty, both at an industry level, and we're involved with wine and seafood and horticulture and food manufacturing, we stepped our way through with our industry groups and the peers within our industry and found a way that we could work safely. And our teams were very much part of building that. And we set about operating under newer, safer, arguably, more robust circumstances. And as I say, that was a real privilege to be able to do that. And it really shows the importance of the primary industry, food and fibre in particular, the importance of that to us as a nation. So absolutely tourism is a part of our strength, and that has been decimated to a degree. But the food industry really has to pick up some of that slack and work probably harder and faster and smarter and better than we did previously.
What role do you think diversity is going to play when it comes to long-term planning and decision making? And how important is it going to be to have truly representative boards and governments?
Having a diverse set of ideas, having a diverse workforce, a diverse board, diverse management, all of those things are unquestionably better for your business. I think more philosophically at this point in time, what I would hope is that people start valuing different kinds of knowledge that is not their own, knowledge that doesn't even resemble their own, because there has to be merit in considering other. If we really valued how much people knew about their own space and place and people, then we would loosen up a little bit and allow for those responses to take place. And the checkpoints is a perfect example. So the people who ran the checkpoints, they knew their communities, they knew what was necessary, they knew how to protect their communities from COVID, and they put them in place. And I really commend both the people who did it, but also the people who cleared the path to a degree for that to happen, because they were super successful.
Now, this is a big question and brings together a lot of the ideas you've talked about. But in your view, what does a post-COVID New Zealand look like?
Probably a little smaller in our movements, a little deeper in our engagements. This is optimistic as well. So smaller in our movements, deeper in our engagements. I think that the world has come together probably in a way that is unanticipated, and that we have all faced the same challenge at the same time, which is, relatively unprecedented. But the way that we each respond to each other changes. The initiative that we've established with Singapore, between New Zealand and Singapore, with regards to supply chain, we're trying to make sure that those supply chains globally are left open. But at the same time, you have a number of countries who are really becoming, or returning even, to quite protectionist measures, quite protectionist behaviours. And that makes it very difficult for a country of New Zealand's size, or lack thereof, to foot it in the world market. And so it's going to take some time to unpack and unpick that and reform relationships, which ensure that we are again a global, or can at least allow for a global trading environment.
The sectors that were hit hardest by COVID were hospitality and tourism. And in Queenstown, Mayor Jim Bolt is facing the humanitarian crisis of thousands of job losses and businesses that will struggle to recover.
It's going to be really tough. I'm really worried for people who are losing their jobs. Week before last, I was counting from the stories in the newspapers redundancies, and in one 3-day period, I counted 1,200. I think we're up around 8,000 unemployed in the district at the present time. I'm worried for those people. I'm worried for how they provide for their families, how they pay their mortgages, how they pay their rent, their car payments, all the rest of it. I'm worried for the small business owners in particular. A lot of them have absolutely put everything they've got into their businesses. Are they going to survive? I'm really concerned for them. I'm asking government to assist to try to keep those businesses alive. I'm also worried about the bigger operators. You might think the larger companies are more robust. Yes, they are. But if they're walking wounded when they come out the end of this, they're not going to be employing people in the numbers that we hope they would. So they will need some assistance as well. So pretty harsh starting ground to go forward. But I take a lot of heart out of several things. One is that we do live in probably the most beautiful part of the world. That won't change. The tourism infrastructure, which is here, the activities, the wineries, the hotels, etc., will still be there. So we will eventually get people back there. I think what I hope will change will be a realisation that we do need to be more resilient in the future, that we do need to target a higher value tourist, that we do need to find other ways of growing our economy. Education, tech industries, medical tourism, just to name a few that come to mind. Look, we're a resilient bunch. We invented lots of new ways of doing things down here, like commercial jet boating and bungee jumping, etc. We'll come through this, and I suspect that we'll be a lot wiser at the end of it.
Well, many of us became a lot wiser and healthier in the way we got around during the restrictions, enjoying a slower pace of life, walking and cycling without the pollution caused by traffic. So has lockdown changed plans for the future at New Zealand's Transport Authority, Waka Kotahi? Here's Chief Executive Nicole Rosie.
I think at level 4, we were down to 70% drop in the utilisation of the transport network, or at least roads, at the peak of lockdown. What we've seen is essentially behaviour has returned to almost pre-COVID levels in terms of use of personal vehicles, and the public transport continued to operate throughout that period, just with reduced capacity and utilisation. So what I would say is COVID-19 has driven a focus on communities and building much better connections at a local level. So walking, cycling within a diameter of your personal home has become much, much more important to people, and people have seen the benefits of using walking and cycling as opposed to their vehicles. So that's great. It's new, and it sort of encourages things like innovating streets and us investing more money into walking and cycling. At the same time, over the short to medium term, and certainly over the long term, there's still a huge demand for public transport, for roads and for rail that we'll need to continue to meet as well. So I think COVID-19 has given us an end. It has certainly said that we need to be multimodal, that we need to produce connections that allow people to operate in multiple ways, but we will still need networks that can be used for freight, roads, rail, cycling, walking, and it's really the integration of those things that's the opportunity out of COVID-19.
How important do you think it is that we have really good collaboration between private and public sectors when we are making these big decisions about where to invest in infrastructure?
Actually, Waka Kotahi is only as successful as the partnerships and collaborations we have, and they work both across public and private partnerships. So I think we can say categorically that we will not be successful in New Zealand unless we collaboratively work closely together between public and private. And we have been doing that for a number of years in this space. I would say that COVID-19 has just highlighted in spades that we need to do that even more broadly in New Zealand in terms of the decisions that we make. Because actually what we're dealing with COVID-19 is a complex problem. It's one of the most complex, if not the most complex problems, certainly in our lifetime, or series of problems. And we all know that complex problems cannot be solved by any party acting alone. And in this context, we need all the skills we can bring to the table, public, private, NGO, young and, I guess old, in terms of solving some of these problems, because actually they're complex, which means by definition, we don't have a known solution to many of these issues. I think in the forward infrastructure space, of course, we do know what types of solutions work, and I think we just need to continue to work on pulling those together into a comprehensive picture.
So those more large-scale construction projects that you're talking about, are they all sort of back underway now? Are you finding that you're able to back operating at sort of 100%?
The challenge of COVID is we've lost a lot of our summer season, so some of those projects are pushing out quite a fair way, just as a result of losing the time that normally a lot of earthworks and other things are done on those large infrastructure projects. But in general, the large infrastructure projects that were underway, that were being built, I think Transmission Gully, Puhoi, there's a number of those types of projects. We are just looking at getting those projects finished. In our broader pipeline, of course, we're looking at that through a COVID-19 lens, and we're asking the question of the future priorities. What are those priorities should we be bringing forward? You talked about walking and cycling, and we've certainly looked at doing some of that, which is our Innovating Streets program is another example of that. But in general, those projects have been based on projections that are 20, 30, 40, 50 years out of what will be happening in those communities and what the demands on the network will be. So when you think about it, a short-term hit on the environment through COVID-19 hasn't really substantially changed the future picture of population growth in New Zealand. There will be some unknowns related to immigration and those types of factors. But the forward projections we use allow us to build some of those things and consider those things.
If you could set a new course for New Zealand's future, what would your priorities be?
Think nationally, think long term, but act in real time and locally. So I think we're operating in infrastructure where we're looking at the future of New Zealand. We're making decisions now for 40 or 50 years' time, really. So I think the opportunity of COVID is to start actually being very ambitious about what we look like in 40 to 50 years' time. To be ambitious, you need to actually do things differently, and you need to change the way you do things. And I think that's the opportunity of COVID. And I think we do a lot of short-term thinking. In the construction sector, it's all about margin. It's all about immediate profit. That's actually how the world is operated. It has driven us to massive environmental impacts globally, and actually it's unsustainable. So, we do need to do things differently. We do need to think differently. New Zealand is uniquely placed to do that. We're small, we're nimble, we're agile. We've shown that through COVID-19. We need to act now, or we won't make the change that we want for our kids, our families, and the future of New Zealand.
Nicole, if you could ask for one thing to be changed, what would it be?
We need to act when we know that there's problems that need to be addressed. That's what we need to change. And I'll give you that as a reflection. About 15 years ago, I was at the Harvard School of Public Health, and in the epidemiology class, they were talking about pandemics. And in that class, they talked about the fact that in the next 15 to 20 years in the world, there would be another pandemic that would affect millions and millions of people, and it would have disastrous economic consequences. Talked about the fact that it had been known for a long time, well understood across the international environment this would occur because it had happened every 100 years in history. And it always affected a significant number of people throughout history. We all needed to be prepared for that because it would have not only huge health impacts, but it would have massive economic impacts. Now, if that is not the best example of us all failing to observe and act on something that had been that well known for a long, long period of time, I don't know what is. COVID-19 is our practice run for environmental change in the world, which will happen on a scale that is many, many times over what we have seen in COVID-19 if we don't take action on that issue of sustainability and acting differently in terms of the future. So if there's one thing that I would change, we've got to stop talking about it. We've got to start actually changing the way we do things. We've got to be ambitious, and we've got to really think with these big assets, 50-year timeframes of doing things completely differently.
Now, as you might have noticed in Nicole's interview there, our Vision Week guests are joining us remotely, and so are their pets. It's the sort of interruption we've all become used to during our remote meetings. So a cameo appearance there from Nicole's cat, Kitty Paws. Great name. Kiwis may have enjoyed walking around their neighbourhoods during lockdown, but we don't always keep our feet on the ground. That's certainly true for New Zealand engineer, founder and chief executive of Rocket Lab, Peter Beck. Belinda Henley asked Peter what the pandemic experience might have done for our ambitions.
This kind of event is although it's horrific, it's still really good in a lot of respects for people to understand that we live in a very dynamic world. It's very easy to sit there and think that the world is very static. It's not. It's hugely dynamic, and whether it be a natural disaster or or something like a pandemic, the world throws stuff at you pretty frequently. So it's good for resilience, I think, especially in I look at my kids growing up, and I think, well, this is good. They've had to live through something that's difficult, and I think it's good human shaping characteristics for them at least.
If you could set a new course for New Zealand's, what would your priorities be?
High productivity, high wage economy, deep tech and incredibly smart businesses, and not being afraid to leverage international capital.
If you could change one thing, now this is a big question, if you could change one thing, what would it be?
Yeah, about the only thing I can think of there is it's really cultural within the New Zealand psyche, and that is to think bigger and go after the really big problems. Sometimes I think Kiwis think they're small island nation, small island minded, but they're not. Being bold enough to go out onto the world stage and do really big things. New Zealanders excel at that, and I'm always surprised whenever I go around big corporations all around the world. You walk past a booth and there's a little Kiwi flag flying in someone's cubicle somewhere, and they're not the cleaners. You'll find that they are senior management, deep technical officers and things like that. So New Zealanders on the international stage are incredibly well recognised and renowned. So if we can do a bit more of that at home, I think that would be a great thing.
Now here's one that I think is particularly apt for you and your business, Peter. Can you think of a time where having a vision for your business meant extraordinary things were achieved?
I'm a strong believer in having a vision for everything, including your business. When you have a vision, it doesn't really matter how large or unachievable the vision seems. Having a really clear vision that everything ties to is super important. When you're undertaking tasks and doing things that sometimes aren't very much fun or really, really hard work, it's always good to be able to relate that back to why you're doing it in the first place. And for us here at Rocket Lab we believe we can have a really positive impact to a large portion of the population of this planet if we can reduce the cost to getting infrastructure and services in orbit. And if you're someone down on the production floor building a rocket and there's a customer satellite going on there, it's a weather satellite, that weather satellite is providing weather to a whole lot of countries around the planet, it's very easy to draw the link between the work that you're doing and the vision. Having a vision is incredibly important, but having one that is very big is really important as well. But making sure that you gate that big vision with milestones along the way so that you just don't spout off some big vision which is, there's no tangible path to getting there. It's making sure that there's a big vision, but also clear objectives and a pathway to get to meeting that vision.
We've brought you the programs this week from the Royal New Zealand Yacht Squadron, where we defend the America's Cup next March. Chairman of our America's Cup Defence Warehouse Group founder and philanthropist Sir Stephen Tyndall says it's another opportunity for New Zealand to show the world just how well we do things.
America's Cup's going to be incredible. We're giving away the content across the world. Anybody can watch it at any time on their devices, so YouTube, Facebook, free to air, and we can use that digital picture to sell New Zealand during the America's Cup. People are going to be glued to these things, and then when travel starts again, and we've been able to manage COVID better than anyone else, we should be the place where they'll come. And if we're smart about that in terms of only welcoming back less people, but people that pay a hell of a lot more, then we'll be the smart little country that people want to come to.
It feels like technology and innovation and a bit of Kiwi ingenuity are going to be really important factors moving forward.
Correct.
Where do you think that kind of Kiwi attitude that we have, or what is it about us as a nation that you think is going to see it put us in good stead moving forward?
It's there, it's endemic in us. The fact is that we were prepared to go out there audaciously and take on the world in the America's Cup, and then after a few tries win it, and then defend it, and then win it again, and now defend it again. Being inside that team, when I see the innovation, it's absolutely incredible. I mean, what we did for Bermuda to beat the rest of the world on at least half the budget and probably a quarter of the budget that those other guys had. When I see what Peter Beck does, the fact that when I first met Peter in the basement of a building when he was just basically getting started, and when I invested in him, we thought, could we actually do this in New Zealand? Could we take on, the space race? And he's done it, So what Peter's done on a particular budget, people around the world would never have believed could have happened. 3D printing the engines, using carbon fibre exactly the same as we do in America's Cup for the fuselage of the spacecraft. He's now building the satellites for people. So you've just got to believe you can do it, and Kiwis do.
Well, one of the many hats you wear is of Chairman of the America's Cup Defence. Things are getting pretty exciting on that front at the moment. Do you see that there are some similarities in terms of New Zealand recovering from COVID and those values that you mentioned, things like having a long-term vision, grit, determination, innovation, beating the rest of the world?
Totally, yeah. Team New Zealand is I think the epitome, the example of why we can pull through and beat the rest of the world. But we've got to be prepared to, do it differently. We've got to say, the old way of working is not right anymore. We basically had a simulator that enabled us at Team New Zealand to work out how fast we would be, what type of foils we needed, how we could beat the other teams. And we did that on the smell of an oily rag. So, if we take that attitude in New Zealand, have the big audacious goal of how we can get there, but do it the Kiwi way. It is referred to as the number 8 wire way of doing it. I don't kind of like that myself, but that from our forefathers was the way they used to do it, and it's kind of the ingrained ability that we have as Kiwis that we believe we can do this stuff, and we should.
Yeah, because when we talk about going back to normal, the reality was for certain sectors of our population, normal wasn't that great.
No, of course it wasn't. Look at the inequality we've got in this country. Since COVID and lockdown, we actually don't have any people living on the streets anymore. We've been able to deal with a lot of those things because there's no pressure at the moment from immigration or tourists on our infrastructure. So, we don't know when the people are going to be coming back. Are we going to be able to have students back in our universities from overseas, or are we going to be able to have a lot more tourists, etc.? But while we haven't, why don't we utilise those things internally and make sure we create a market that makes the money go around here in New Zealand?
Through your work at the Tyndall Foundation, you have supported many New Zealanders over many years. Do you think you're going to see more need than ever before in the coming years?
Yeah, I do. I think we'll see a lot more need. Clearly we are headed for a depression, and that's tough. That's a tough time. However, we've got some really good things going for us in this country. We can grow as much food as we need. A friend of mine who ran Tesco in the UK used to tell me they had 6 days worth of food in the UK because they imported everything. We're a net exporter. We can grow everything we want. It's a matter, I guess, of organising things so that people don't go hungry. And so that's already been happening. I've been involved in a thing called Kiwi Harvest, the New Zealand Food Network, and we've stood up a whole lot of last mile people like the Volunteer Student Army, Whānau Ora, a lot of iwi, a lot of marae, and they're kind of delivering food to people that need it. But the great thing about that is if you involve the people at the front end, they know who need it the most. They make sure that they segment things.
If you could set a new course for New Zealand, what would your priorities be?
To leverage our clean green image, not just from a tourist perspective, but on the basis that we're already 82% renewable. There is a huge demand from overseas at the moment for green hydrogen and green ammonia. There's absolutely nothing that would stop us from actually manufacturing our own liquid fuels to export to Asia, but also to attract big investment from people who want to be part of this green wave. And so that's data centres that will run on green energy instead of coal, and everything you can actually think about that makes New Zealand a much more viable place. So, for example, the Cook Strait ferries running on hydrogen, etc. So it's kind of the theme of using the latest technology, thinking about being in the 21st century, using 5G, for example, ultra fast, to utilise new ways of working so that we can be different to what we were.
We are just about at the end of Vision Week's program's 5 days of imagining a better future for New Zealand. And although our programs are coming to an end, this is just the beginning. Vision Week will prepare a report summarising all the feedback we've had from Kiwis, and we hope that this is a practical way to start the debate on a better future for New Zealand. So please keep the conversation alive on our website, where you'll also find longer versions of the interviews that you've heard this week. Remember, he waka eke noa. We are in this boat together, and we need everybody to be part of our vision for the future. Ngā mihi nui, hei kona.
As a Persian, I was raised in the traditions of the Sufi tea houses, where everyone gathered to share and debate ideas together. With these foundations and values, my vision for our home, New Zealand, is that for the most systemic, complex opportunities facing us, we invest in, design, and facilitate strategic collaborations where all the voices are heard and solutions emerge together.
What do we want to tell the government that we want as part of our future for New Zealand? And as a few quiet yarns in the tech industry, our focus of course is tech. So what we didn't see in the budget is a big focus on tech. Nearly $4 billion was sent to shovel-ready projects. To me, that is money being put into the ground that will never come out. Whereas if we put money into tech, that will continue to earn money for us. We need product managers, we need business analysts, we need QAs, we need sales and marketing. So there's a whole range of roles that are actually transferable. So if you're in those non-tech specific roles like PM, BA, sales, marketing, etc., you could transfer from another industry and bring all of your experience from your role across to the tech industry.
When done well, collaboration is an opportunity for us to take a totally strengths-based approach. We acknowledge that we alone are not enough to deliver what's needed, but we identify our strengths and the strengths of all those that we partner with. We work together across all kinds of differences, silos, sectors, cultures, and disciplines. In the spirit of humility, openness, and manaakitanga, respect and generosity, we allow all the voices to be heard and solutions to emerge together. We have an opportunity to take time to find the best solutions for all of us and for the generations to come. Let's not waste it.